Nobody spoke when the last vote was counted. The assembly hall of the Galactic Concord had seen arguments that lasted for days, debates that shook alliances, and speeches that changed the course of entire species. But in that moment, as the final tally appeared on the central display, there was only silence. Every delegate from every species simply stared at the number. Unanimous. For the first time in recorded galactic history, all 212 member species had agreed on something. They were going to activate the beacon of last resort. High Speaker Toranu stood at the center of the hall, his tall, insectoid frame rigid, his four arms folded tightly against his chest. He had argued for this. He had pushed for this. And now that it was approved, a cold dread had settled into every joint of his body. The beacon was not a weapon. It was a signal ancient beyond understanding, coded to reach worlds that the Conquered had classified and locked away centuries ago. Deathworlds. Planets so hostile, so violent, so saturated with danger that no sane species could have evolved there. And yet, according to old records, some had. The reason for the vote was simple. The devouring tide was winning. In 8 galactic cycles, the tide had consumed 14 star systems. Not conquered, not occupied, consumed. Every planet stripped to bare rock, every ocean drained, every living thing absorbed into the swarm's endless biomass. The Conquered's combined fleets had fought back and lost every single engagement. The tide did not negotiate. It did not slow down. It simply ate, grew, and moved forward. Toranu gave the order himself. He pressed his claw against the authorization panel and felt the vibration travel through the floor as somewhere deep beneath the assembly station, a machine older than most civilizations powered up for the first time in millennia. The beacon fired its signal outward into the black. Then they waited. Days passed, weeks. Conquered leaders began whispering that the beacon was broken, that the Deathworld species were long extinct, that this had been a waste of their final hope. Toranu sat in his quarters each night, staring at sensor reports that showed the tide advancing toward 3 more populated systems. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping properly. He began writing farewell messages to his family on the Selori homeworld. On the 19th day, a junior sensor technician on the Conquered's outer monitoring station dropped her data tablet. It hit the floor and cracked, but she did not pick it up. She was too busy staring at her screen. A fleet-scale, faster-than-light signature had appeared at the edge of Conquered space. It was massive, not large, not significant, massive. The sensor systems tried to count the individual ships and kept failing because the number was too high for the software to process in real time. By the time Toranu reached the command center, the count had stabilized. 4,000 warships. 4,000. The largest Conquered fleet ever assembled had been 600 vessels, and that had taken 3 years to organize. These 4,000 ships had appeared simultaneously, in perfect formation, as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment. The flagship broadcast a message on every open frequency. It was in a language the translation systems had to work hard to decode, but when the words appeared on Toranu's screen, they were brutally simple. This is Admiral Riva Akafer of the Combined Solar Fleet. We received your signal. Tell us where to fight. Toranu read the message 3 times. His aide, a young Selori named Fenu, leaned over his shoulder and read it too. Solar Fleet, Fenu whispered. That means they come from a single star system. One system produced 4,000 warships. Toranu pulled up the classified file on the Deathworld that matched the signal's origin coordinates. The planet was called Earth, 3rd rock from an average yellow star. The file was short and contained a warning at the top in red text that read, "Under no circumstances should contact be initiated with this world's dominant species." He read the summary: extreme gravity, volatile weather systems, predator-dense ecosystems covering every landmass and ocean, tectonic instability, seasonal temperature swings that would kill most Conquered species, and the dominant species, called humans, had not only survived all of this but had thrived. They had fought each other in global wars, survived extinction-level asteroid impacts, and clawed their way into space through sheer stubbornness. Toranu closed the file and looked at the sensor display. 4,000 ships sat motionless at the edge of conquered space, waiting politely for a response. Each ship was bristling with weapons systems that the Conquered's analysts were already struggling to classify. "High Speaker," Fenno said carefully, "what do we do?" Toranu stood very still. He had called for help. Help had come. But looking at the sheer scale of what had answered, he felt a new kind of fear layering itself on top of the old one. The devouring tide was a force of nature, mindless and hungry. But these humans were something else entirely. They were organized, they were ready, and they had come willingly. He opened a reply channel and spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "Admiral Akafor, this is High Speaker Toranu of the Galactic Conquered. We are grateful for your response. We will transmit tactical data and coordinates immediately. The enemy is called the Devouring Tide, and it is heading for populated systems." The Admiral's reply came back in less than 10 seconds. "Understood, we are moving now. Akafor out." Toranu watched the sensor display as 4,000 ships turned in unison and began accelerating toward the front line. Not a single ship broke formation. Not a single one hesitated. He turned to Fennu and said quietly, "What have we called to our door?" Fennu had no answer, neither did anyone else. The airlock hissed open, and Sub-Commander Pilek stepped onto a human warship for the first time in his life. He immediately wished he had not volunteered for this assignment. The gravity hit him first. It pressed down on his small amphibian body like an invisible hand, forcing him to lock his knees just to stay upright. The Conquered standard was about 60% of what humans apparently considered normal. Pilek felt like he was wearing a suit made of stone. Then came the air. It was thick, warm, and carried a dozen smells he could not identify. Metal, something chemical, something organic and alive. And underneath it all, the faint scent of sweat, because humans apparently leaked fluid from their skin when they exerted themselves, which was constantly. 2 human soldiers were waiting for him in the corridor. They towered over Pilek by at least 3 body lengths. Their uniforms were dark and fitted tightly to frames packed with dense muscle. One of them smiled, which Pilek's briefing file had warned him about. Humans showed their teeth when they were happy. It was supposed to be friendly. It did not look friendly. "Sub-Commander Pilek," the smiling one said, "welcome aboard the Unyielding Dawn. The Admiral is expecting you. Follow us, please." Pilek followed. He had no choice. He was the liaison officer assigned by Toranu to work directly with the Human Fleet Command, and refusing the assignment would have been a career-ending decision. So he walked through corridors that hummed with power, past rooms where human crew members worked at stations covered in blinking lights, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that every single person he passed could crush him with one hand. Admiral Riva Akafor met him in the Tactical Operations Center. She was not what Pilek had expected. She was tall, yes, and built with the same dense physicality as every other human, but her eyes were calm, almost gentle. She extended a hand, and Pilek had been briefed on this too. Handshake. A greeting ritual. He reached up and placed his small webbed fingers against her palm, and she closed her grip with careful softness. "Thank you for coming, Sub-Commander," she said. "I know this is not easy for you. We will do our best to make you comfortable." Pilek blinked. He had been prepared for aggression, bluntness, maybe even hostility. Politeness was not in his briefing file. "I have been instructed to provide your fleet with full tactical data on the Devouring Tide," Pilek said, keeping his voice steady. "Troop movements, swarm composition, attack patterns, everything the Conquered has recorded." "Good," Akafor said. She gestured to a large display table and her officers gathered around. "Show us everything." Pilek activated his data pad and began projecting the information. He showed them the tide's advance across 14 systems. He showed them footage of swarm attacks. millions of bioorganic drones pouring through space like a living river. He showed them what happened to planets after the tide passed through. Bare rock, dead oceans, nothing left. He expected shock, horror, maybe panic. Instead, the humans watched in total silence. Their faces did not change. When the footage of a consumed colony world played, showing empty cities and stripped forests, Pilek saw something shift in the room. It was not fear. It was anger. Cold, controlled, focused anger. The kind that did not explode but instead settled deep into bone and stayed there. "How fast does it adapt?" a human officer asked. "Rapidly," Pilek said. "The tide analyzes every weapon used against it and develops biological countermeasures within days." The officers exchanged glances. One of them actually grinned. "Sounds like a challenge," the officer said. Pilek did not understand how anyone could smile at that information. After the briefing, a young human lieutenant named Io was assigned to give Pilek a tour of the ship. Io was cheerful in a way that felt almost aggressive, talking constantly as they walked through corridor after corridor. The armory made Pilek stop walking. Racks upon racks of weapons filled a room larger than most conquered ships. Kinetic rifles that fired solid metal at terrifying speeds, explosive launchers, chemical grenades, plasma cutters designed for close combat, and on one wall, hanging in neat rows, were bladed weapons. Knives, short swords, and something called a machete that Io described as good for brush clearing and also everything else. "Why do you have bladed weapons on a starship?" Pilek asked weakly. Io shrugged. "Sometimes things get close." The training deck was worse. Humans were sparring with each other, throwing punches and grappling with a violence that would have hospitalized any conquered species. Others were running on machines, lifting heavy objects, or doing something called push-ups that involved lowering their entire body weight to the floor and pressing back up, over and over. "How long can your soldiers fight continuously?" Pilek asked. "Depends on the situation," Io said. 72 hours if we have to. Longer with stims, but the Admiral does not like using those." 72 hours. Pilek's species could manage 6 hours of sustained activity before requiring rest. Most conquered species were similar. At the end of the tour, Pilek found himself standing at a viewport, looking out at the fleet. Thousands of warships stretched in every direction, each one carrying hundreds of these impossible creatures. He turned to Io. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Why did you come? Your world is far from here. The tide is not threatening your system. You could have ignored the beacon." Io was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because someone asked for help." Pilek stared at her. That was it. That was the entire reason. Someone had asked and 4,000 warships had answered. That night Pilek sent a private message to Torano. He spent a long time choosing his words. Finally, he typed, "They are not what we feared. They are something far stranger. They care." He sent it and sat in the quarters the humans had adjusted for him, with lower gravity and softer light, and wondered what it meant that the deadliest species in the galaxy had taken the time to make a small amphibian comfortable. The evacuation sirens on the Narowi colony had been screaming for 2 days straight, and nobody was coming to turn them off. 2 billion dressy civilians lived on this world. Families, children, workers, elders. The colony had been built over generations, a peaceful place of shallow, warm seas and gentle blue forests where the dressy had made their second home. Now, sensor arrays on the far side of the system showed a wall of biological signatures advancing toward them. The devouring tide had arrived. The Concord's local defense fleet, 40 ships, was already powering up their FTL drives. Standard protocol. When the tide came for a world, you ran. You saved what ships you could and you left the planet behind. It had happened 14 times before. It would happen again. Then a new fleet dropped out of FTL between the colony and the approaching swarm. 400 human warships formed a wall across the system, weapons already hot, shields already raised. Admiral Akafer's voice came through on every conquered frequency, calm and clear. Conquered Defense Fleet, this is Admiral Akafer. Power down your FTL drives. No one is leaving. No one is being left behind. We will hold this line. The conquered fleet commander, a nervous Selori named Watan, opened a private channel to Akafer. Admiral, with respect, you do not understand. We cannot hold against the tide. Our doctrine requires withdrawal to preserve our remaining forces. Your doctrine is wrong, Akafer said. There was no anger in her voice, just a flat certainty. There are 2 billion people on that planet. We are not leaving them. Watan looked at his bridge crew. They looked back at him. Nobody moved to restart the FTL drives. Something about the human admiral's voice made running feel impossible. At the vanguard of the human formation, Captain Danny Herrera stood in the command pit of the Iron Pact, a mid-class destroyer that had seen more combat deployments than most ships twice its size. Herrera was short, loud, and had a habit of eating protein bars during battle briefings. Her crew loved her because she never asked them to do anything she would not do first. "All right, listen up," she said over the ship's intercom. "The big ugly cloud of space bugs is about 30 minutes out. We are the front door and we are not opening it. Gunners, I want firing solutions ready on my mark. Damage control teams, preposition on decks 4 through 9. And somebody make sure the coffee maker is strapped down this time because I am not cleaning that up again." Her crew laughed, nervous laughter but real. That was the point. The tide's forward swarm appeared on visual sensors 28 minutes later. Pilek, watching from the unyielding Dawn's observation deck, felt his blood go cold. It was like watching a living storm roll across space. Millions of bioorganic drones, each one ranging from the size of a small shuttle to the size of a cruiser, moving in a shifting, pulsing mass that blocked out the stars behind it. The Conquered had been fighting this for 8 cycles, and losing every time. "All ships weapons free," Akafer ordered. The human fleet opened fire. Pilek had seen Conquered weapons in action. Energy beams, light missiles, disruption fields. They were precise and clean. Human weapons were none of those things. The railguns fired solid metal slugs at a fraction of light speed, and when they hit tide organisms, the creatures simply exploded into clouds of frozen biomass. Missile salvos streaked into the swarm in dense clusters and detonated inside carrier organisms, blowing them apart from the inside. Point defense networks created interlocking fields of rapid-fire projectiles that shredded everything that came within range. The sound on the tactical channel was chaos. Human officers called targets, confirmed kills, and redirected fire with a speed that Pilek's translator struggled to keep up with. Herrera's voice cut through regularly, sharp and focused. "Iron Pact shift fire to Sector 7. 2 big ones coming through. Hit them before they split." The tide pushed forward. It always pushed forward. For every organism destroyed, 10 more filled the gap. But the human line held. Ships took hits, absorbed damage, and kept firing. Pilek watched a human frigate lose its entire port side to a ramming attack and somehow continue operating, its crew sealing breaches and rerouting power while still shooting. Then the tide adapted. Smaller organisms began clustering together, forming living shields that absorbed kinetic impacts. Fast-moving units appeared, dodging missile locks with sudden bursts of acceleration. A group of them broke through the line and slammed into Herrera's destroyer. The Iron Pact shuddered. Alarms screamed. 3 decks lost hull integrity in seconds, atmosphere venting into space. Pilek watched the ship's status on the tactical display and waited for it to pull back. It did not pull back. Herrera's crew sealed the breaches with emergency patches while still returning fire. Damage control teams worked in vacuum, holding their breath for seconds at a time, welding hull plates by hand. The Iron Pact kept its position in the line. The battle lasted 4 hours. When the swarm finally pulled back, The space between the fleets was filled with the drifting remains of millions of tide organisms. The human fleet had lost 2 frigates and taken heavy damage across a dozen more ships, but the line had held. The colony was safe. Pilek made his way to the medical bay of the unyielding dawn, expecting to find it filled with human wounded. It was, but it was also filled with conquered wounded. Human medics were treating injured conquered soldiers alongside their own, adjusting techniques for different biologies, learning on the spot, refusing to prioritize one species over another. In the corner of the bay, Warden Gull sat on the floor. The massive reptilian barraki soldier had fought in a boarding action when tide organisms had breached a conquered vessel. A human marine, a woman half Gull's size named Bry, had pulled him out of a collapsing corridor and carried him to safety. Gull looked at Bry. Bry was getting her arm bandaged and wincing. Gull reached out with one enormous clawed hand and placed it gently on the marine's shoulder. It was a barraki gesture of deep respect. Bry looked up and nodded. "You would have done the same," she said. Gull said nothing, but for the first time in his life he thought she might be right. 6 days of silence felt worse than any battle. The devouring tide had pulled back after the fight at Nairobi, and it had not returned. No probing attacks, no scouts, nothing on long-range sensors except empty space and the faint biological residue of the swarm's retreat. For most conquered officers, this would have been a relief. For Admiral Akafor, it was a warning. "It is learning," she told her command staff during the morning briefing. "Every hour it stays quiet is an hour it spends analyzing what we did and figuring out how to beat it." She used the time wisely. Within 2 days, she had opened a joint training program with every conquered ship in the sector. This shocked the conquered commanders. Species in the conquered did not share military tactics. Alliances were political, not operational. Each species kept its strategies locked behind classification walls, even from allies. Akafor ignored all of that. She transmitted human point defense coordination protocols to every conquered vessel. She sent damage control procedures adapted for 6 different alien biologies. She invited conquered officers aboard human ships for tactical workshops and sent human advisors to conquered vessels in return. "You are giving them everything," Pilek said to her one evening, unable to hide his disbelief. "Your weapons data, your formation tactics, your communication encryption. Are you not worried they will use it against you someday?" Akafor looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. Patient, slightly amused, and completely unbothered. "If sharing our tactics keeps your people alive long enough to betray us later, then at least they will be alive," she said. "That is the priority." Pilek had no answer for that kind of logic. It was irrational by every standard he knew. And yet it worked. The training sessions produced unexpected results. Conquered crews, many of whom had spent the entire war retreating and losing, began to change. Human instructors taught them not just how to fight better, but how to believe they could fight at all. The humans had a strange habit of celebrating small victories, a repaired weapon system, a successful drill, a new personal speed record, and the enthusiasm was infectious. Pilek noticed other changes too. During downtime, human soldiers did not sit quietly like conquered crews. They played music on small personal devices. They cooked meals from basic ration packs with an absurd level of creativity, arguing passionately about spice combinations. They drew pictures, told jokes, and played physical games that seemed to involve throwing objects at each other's heads. "Why do they do this?" Pilek asked Io, his assigned guide. "Do what?" "All of this." Pilek gestured at a group of Marines who were singing together while cleaning their weapons. "You are in a war zone. You could die tomorrow, and they are singing." Io thought about it. "Because we could die tomorrow," she said simply. "That is exactly why." Several conquered crew members began joining the human activities. A dressy engineer learned to play a card game. A Cellori navigator started cooking alongside the human galley staff, and Warden Gull, the enormous Baraki warrior, began training daily with human marines. Gull was physically larger and stronger than any human on the ship. He could lift loads that would break a human spine. But after 3 days of training together, he admitted something to Bry, the marine who had saved him. "Your endurance is terrifying," he said, breathing hard after a sparring session. "I can overpower any of you in a single burst, but you do not stop. You fight, you rest for 4 hours, and you fight again. I need a full day to recover." Bry grinned at him. "On Earth, the things that chased us never got tired either, so we learned not to." On the 6th day, long-range sensors detected the second wave. The tide had changed. New organism types appeared in the swarm, things no one had seen before. Heavily shielded units that absorbed kinetic rounds without bursting. Fast-attack creatures that moved with erratic, unpredictable patterns, making missile targeting nearly impossible. And at the center of the formation, a massive organism larger than a conquered battleship, pulsing with a bioluminescent glow that the analysts identified as a command and control node. The tide had built itself a brain. The battle was brutal from the first second. The new shielded organism soaked up railgun fire and kept coming. The fast movers slipped through point defense nets and struck at ship hulls directly. 3 human vessels were destroyed in the first hour, torn apart by coordinated ramming attacks that the old swarm had never been smart enough to execute. Herrera and the Iron Pact found themselves surrounded. The destroyer had lost its main railgun to a direct hit and was fighting with secondary weapons and sheer stubbornness. When a cluster of tide organisms latched onto the hull, Herrera ordered her crew to vent specific compartments, blowing the creatures off with explosive decompression, then sealed the ship back up and kept fighting. The conquered line buckled. Watan's defense ships began falling back. But this time, something different happened. Instead of running, 2 conquered frigates held their positions. Their crews had trained with humans for 6 days. They had learned that a line holds when everyone holds it. Akafor saw the central organism directing the swarm and made her decision. She pulled 12 heavy cruisers out of the main formation and concentrated their fire on a single target. The combined bombardment hit the command organism from 12 directions simultaneously. It cracked, it shuddered, and when it died, the swarm around it went insane. Without coordination, the tide organisms attacked randomly, crashed into each other, and broke apart into scattered groups that the fleet picked off one by one. Victory, but the cost was real. 3 human ships gone, 11 more heavily damaged, over 400 human dead and twice that wounded. The conquered had lost ships too, but fewer than they would have without the humans. That night, Akafor opened a direct channel to High Speaker Toranu. "We can win battles," she said, "but the tide keeps adapting. If we just defend, it will eventually find something we cannot counter. We need to end this war. Where is the Tide Mother?" Toranu was silent for a long time. "No one has ever gone looking for the Tide Mother," he said. "Every expedition sent into consumed space was lost entirely." "Then it is time someone tried again," Akafor said. Toranu heard the words and felt something shift in his chest. It was not fear. It was something he had not felt in a very long time. It was hope. The stars disappeared one by one as the strike force crossed into consumed space. It started slowly. A star on the navigation chart that should have been bright was dim, surrounded by a haze of orbiting biomass. Then another. Then 3 more. Within hours of crossing the boundary, the fleet was moving through a graveyard of solar systems where every planet had been eaten alive and every sun was cloaked in a shell of harvested organic matter. Pilek stood at the viewport of the unyielding dawn and pressed his webbed hands against the glass. He could see the remains of what had once been a dressy colony system. The planet was still there, technically, but it was a gray husk. No atmosphere, no water. The tide had taken everything down to the mineral layer and moved on. He had volunteered for this mission. Toranu had tried to stop him, arguing that a liaison officer was too valuable to risk on what was essentially a suicide run. Pilek had looked at his high speaker and said something he never thought he would say to a superior. Someone from the Conquered should witness this. Whatever happens, our people should know the truth. Toranu had let him go. 300 ships made up the strike force. It was a fraction of the full human fleet, but Akafar had chosen them carefully. Fast ships, tough ships, ships with crews that had already bled and kept fighting. The unyielding Dawn led the formation, with Herrera's battered iron pact holding the vanguard position because Herrera had refused to be left behind. "My ship has more patches than hull at this point," she had told Akafar. "One more trip is not going to make a difference." Gull was aboard too, commanding a mixed squad of human marines and Baraki soldiers. It was the first joint combat unit in Conquered history, and it had been Gull's idea. After training with humans for days, he had told Akafar that if boarding action was needed, he wanted his people fighting alongside hers. Akafar had agreed without hesitation. The first swarm contact came 12 hours into consumed space. A patrol cluster of tide organisms detected the fleet and attacked immediately. It was small, maybe 10,000 drones, nothing compared to the waves they had fought before. The fleet destroyed it in minutes, but Akafar knew the swarm shared information. The Tide Mother now knew they were coming. After that, the attacks came in layers. Every few hours, another wave hit them. Each one was larger and smarter than the last. The tide was throwing barriers in their path, trying to slow them, wear them down, bleed them dry before they reached the center. It worked partially. Ships fell. The strike force lost 20 vessels in the first 2 days, then 10 more on the third day. The humans mourned their dead in a way Pilek had never seen before. They held brief ceremonies, spoke the names of the fallen out loud, and then went back to their stations and kept fighting. There was no collapse, no despair, just grief held tightly alongside duty. Pilek asked Herrera about it during a quiet moment between engagements. "How do you keep going when you lose people?" Herrera was sitting in her command chair, eating a ration bar with one hand and reading damage reports with the other. She did not look up when she answered, "Because someone behind us cannot." It was the same answer Io had given him weeks ago. Pilek was beginning to understand that it was not just a phrase. It was the core of what made humans fight. They did not protect because it was logical. They protected because they could not live with themselves if they did not. On the 4th day, they found the Tide Mother. The sensors painted the picture before the viewports could. At the center of a dead system, orbiting a dying red star, was an organism the size of a small moon. It was ancient. Its surface was covered in layers of accumulated biomass from millions of years of feeding, forming ridges and valleys that looked like a twisted landscape. Bioluminescent veins pulsed across its body in slow, rhythmic waves. And around it, billions of drones moved in patterns that were almost beautiful, like schools of fish circling a reef. The bridge of the unyielding dawn went silent. "That is the Tide Mother," Pilek whispered. Akafar studied the sensor data for a long time. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She opened a communication channel aimed directly at the organism. "This is Admiral Riva Akafar of the human species. I am addressing the intelligence at the center of the devouring tide. If you can understand me, I want to talk." Nothing happened for 30 seconds. Then the ship's communication systems erupted with data. Not words. Biological signals, chemical patterns, electromagnetic pulses. The translation software struggled, crashed, rebooted, and struggled again. But slowly, meaning emerged. The Tide Mother was responding. Its message was simple and alien. It did not think in terms of species or civilizations. To the Tide Mother, the universe contained 2 things, the tide and food. Everything that was not part of the swarm existed only to be consumed. This was not cruelty. It was biology. The Tide Mother had been born to feed, and feeding was all it knew. Akafar listened to everything the translation provided. Then she made an offer that no species in galactic history had ever considered. There are star systems with no sapient life, she said. Rich in biomass, organic compounds, everything you need. We will lead you to them. You can feed without destroying civilizations. We can coexist. The Tide Mother processed this. The drones around it slowed their patterns. For a moment, the entire system seemed to hold its breath. Then the swarm began to shift. Drones changed formation. The bioluminescent pulses on the Tide Mother's surface increased in speed. Pilek gripped the edge of his console. Is it accepting? Akafar watched the tactical display. Her expression did not change, but her hand moved slowly toward the fleet command controls. I do not know, she said quietly. Everyone stand ready. The swarm kept shifting, and the galaxy waited. The answer came not in words, but in a wave of drones that surged toward the fleet like a tidal wall. The Tide Mother had rejected the offer, not out of hatred or anger because it was incapable of both. It rejected coexistence because its biology would not allow limitation. It had been born to consume everything. The concept of stopping, of choosing, of leaving something alive when it could be eaten, was as foreign to its ancient mind as breathing was to a stone. It knew only one response to things that were not the tide. Devour. Admiral Akafar had prepared for this. She had hoped for peace, planned for peace, but she had positioned her fleet for war. The moment the swarm surged, her voice filled every channel across the strike force. All ships battle formation. This is the last fight, make it count. Across conquered space, every ship that could still fly was already burning toward the Tide Mother's system. Toranu had given the order the moment the strike force crossed into consumed space. If the humans were going to the heart of the beast, the conquered would be right behind them. 400 conquered vessels arrived in staggered waves, joining the surviving human ships in a combined fleet that stretched across the dead system like a wall of metal and light. The battle that followed was the largest in recorded galactic history. Billions of Tide drones filled the space around the Tide Mother, forming layers of defense so dense that sensors could barely distinguish individual organisms. The combined fleet hit those layers with everything it had. Human railguns punched corridors through the swarm. Conquered energy weapons swept those corridors clean. Missile salvos from both species detonated in synchronized patterns, creating expanding spheres of destruction that pushed the swarm back meter by meter. But the tide kept coming. It always kept coming. Captain Herrera led the iron packed into the thickest part of the swarm. Her ship was already barely holding together, hull patches covering hull patches, half her weapon systems running on emergency power. None of that mattered. The iron pact drove forward like a blade, its remaining guns firing continuously as it carved a path toward the Tide Mother's outer defenses. A massive tide organism, something new, something built specifically to kill capital ships, slammed into the iron pact from below. The destroyer's spine broke. The ship split in two, atmosphere and fire venting from the wound. Herrera ordered immediate evacuation. Armored escape pods launched from both halves of the dying ship, rocketing away from the wreckage as human rescue frigates moved in to collect them. Herrera's pod was the last to launch. She stayed until every crew member was off. When rescue ships pulled her pod in, she was already on comms, coordinating fire support from a stretcher. Deep inside the swarm, Gull led his boarding team onto one of the Tide Mother's orbital structures, a massive ring of biomass that served as a drone factory. The corridors inside were alive, walls pulsing and shifting, the air thick with organic compounds that burned conquered lungs. Human Marines wore sealed helmets and kept moving. Gull's Baraki soldiers wrapped cloth around their faces and followed. They fought through corridors of living tissue, destroying growth nodes and severing the biological connections that fed the Tide Mother's production capacity. A tide defender, a creature of claws and acid, burst from a wall and lunged at the team's medic, a young human named Sani. Gull threw himself between them. The creature's claws raked across his chest armor, cracking it open and drawing blood. Gull grabbed the organism with both hands and crushed it against the floor. Sani looked at the wound. "Warden, you need medical attention." Later, Gull said and kept walking. On the unyielding dawn, Pilek had found his place. He sat at the communications hub, coordinating signals between human and conquered ships, translating tactical commands in real time, routing fleet data through systems he had learned to operate in a matter of weeks. He was not a warrior. He was not strong or fast or built for a death world. But in that moment, linking two civilizations together across the chaos of battle, he was essential. He was no longer afraid. He realized that somewhere between the first handshake with Akafar and the sound of humans singing in the corridors, his fear had been replaced by something he had never expected to feel: belonging. Akafar watched the battle unfold from the command deck, her hands steady on the fleet controls. She had committed everything, every ship, every weapon, every reserve. There was nothing held back. All capital ships, concentrate fire on the Tide Mother. Full bombardment, everything you have. 200 warships, human and conquered alike, turned their weapons toward the moon-sized organism at the center of the system. Railguns, energy lances, plasma torpedoes, nuclear-tipped missiles, and weapons that did not have names yet converged on a single point. The Tide Mother shuddered. Its bioluminescent veins flickered. Cracks appeared across its surface, venting gas and biomass into space. The drones around it went wild, attacking blindly, crashing into each other, losing the coordination that had made them deadly. The second volley hit, the third, the fourth. The Tide Mother broke apart. Slowly at first, then all at once, the ancient organism that had consumed civilizations for millions of years split open and died in silence. No sound in space, no dramatic explosion, just a vast, old thing finally stopping. Across the galaxy, the swarm lost its mind. Without the Tide Mother's guiding intelligence, billions of drones became mindless. They drifted, collided, and slowly began to die. In system after system, the devouring tide fell apart. The war was over. 3 weeks later, the conquered assembly reconvened. The hall was fuller than it had been in years. Species that had been preparing evacuation plans were now sending delegates again. Toranu stood at the center and formally welcomed humanity into the Galactic Conquered, not as Deathworld monsters, not as weapons, but as members, allies, friends. Pilek wrote his official report that night. He spent hours on it, writing and rewriting, trying to capture what he had witnessed. The final line took him the longest. He typed it, deleted it, typed it again, and finally left it. "We sent a signal into the dark, hopping for a weapon. What answered was something far more dangerous. A species that fights not because it must, but because it believes others deserve to live." On the bridge of the unyielding dawn, Akafar stood at the viewport. Beside her, Pilek and Gull stood in comfortable silence. The fleet, battered and scarred but intact, began its long journey home. Somewhere on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable star, the people of Earth had no idea what their soldiers had done. But the galaxy would never forget.